The October wind cut through Joseph Anderson's worn jacket like a blade. He sat with his back against the cold marble facade of the Harold Washington Library, a tattered copy of Marcus Aurelius clutched in his weathered hands. At 68, Joe had learned to endure many indignities. Hunger, cold, the way people's eyes slid past him as if he were invisible. But tonight something different was coming. Laughter echoed down Michigan Avenue. Sharp, theatrical laughter that made Joe look up from his book. 3 figures approached, backlit by street lamps. The one in the center moved with the particular swagger of someone who'd never been told no, never been denied, never faced real consequence. Behind him, a cameraman walked backwards, professional equipment catching the gleam of expensive watches and designer clothes. "There!" The young man pointed directly at Joe. "Perfect. Camera ready? This is going to be gold." Joe carefully marked his page and looked up. He'd been a teacher for 32 years. He knew the look of a student who thought themselves clever. "Rolling," the cameraman announced. The young man's face transformed into practiced compassion. "Well, hello there, friend. Vincent Pratt here, and I'm doing my part to help the less fortunate of Chicago. What's your name, sir?" Joe studied the performance, the expensive smile, the camera angled just right. The $100 bill already in Vincent's hand, ready for its close-up. "Joseph Anderson," Joe said quietly. "Most people call me Joe." "Joe, fantastic!" Vincent held up the crisp bill. "Now, Joe, I'm sure a man of your situation could use a little help, right? I'm going to give you this $100, no strings attached. Just trying to spread some love." Around them, passers-by slowed. Phones emerged from pockets. This was content. This was entertainment. Joe looked at the money, then at Vincent, then at the camera. "Tell me, son," Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent teaching critical thinking. "How many hours did you work to earn that $100? Vincent's smile flickered. It's $100. Money, for food." "I'm asking," Joe continued calmly, "what that money cost you. Because in my experience, the value of money isn't in its face value, but in what we sacrifice to earn it. That bill represents about 4 hours of labor from my teaching days. 4 hours of shaping young minds. How many hours of yourself did it cost you?" The smile on Vincent's face hardened into something uglier. "Listen, street professor, I'm trying to do something nice here. You want the money or not?" "What I want," Joe said softly, "is for you to understand that charity without compassion is just transaction. You're not helping me, son. You're purchasing content." "Oh, we've got a philosopher." Vincent turned to the camera, his voice dripping with contempt. "Folks, this is what happens when you try to help people. They lecture you." He thrust the bill toward Joe more aggressively. "Here, take it. Consider it payment for the wisdom, professor." Joe took the bill slowly, as if it were contaminated. "Thank you for your generosity." The way he said generosity made it sound like an indictment. Vincent turned back to the camera, grin restored. "There you go, folks. Another life changed by the Vincent Pratt Foundation. Remember to like, subscribe, and check out my crypto course in the description." As they walked away, Joe heard Vincent's voice carrying back. "Can you believe that guy? Trying to make me feel bad for helping him." Joe sat in the cold October night, the $100 bill in his hand, and felt not anger, but profound sadness. Sadness for a young man who'd never been taught the difference between generosity and performance. What Vincent didn't know, what nobody on that corner knew, was that Joe had taught at Lincoln Park Academy 2 decades ago. That among his thousands of former students was a teenager named Vincent Pratt, who'd failed 11th grade history twice because he refused to do the reading, preferring to rely on family money rather than personal effort. And Vincent certainly didn't know that within 72 hours, that viral video would set in motion events that would teach him a lesson far more valuable than anything he'd learned, or failed to learn, in high school. The video posted at 9:47 p.m. By midnight, 60,000 views. By morning, millions. Joseph Anderson stood at the chalkboard, writing dates with careful precision. Behind him, 32 juniors ranged from deeply engaged to actively sleeping. Near the back, teenage Vincent Pratt played with his phone under the desk. "The market crash of 1929, Joe said, turning to face the class, didn't happen because of a single event. It happened because people believed in an illusion. that wealth could grow infinitely without being tied to real value. A girl named Sarah raised her hand. "Mr. Anderson, are you saying money isn't real?" Joe's eyes lit up with the particular joy of a good question. "I'm saying money is only as real as the trust we place in it. A collective agreement, a shared fiction. But when that trust breaks down, when we realize the emperor has no clothes, everything collapses." Vincent snorted loud enough to be heard. "My dad says people who don't have money spend all their time philosophizing about it." The classroom went quiet. Joe turned to look at Vincent directly, his expression neutral but tired. "Your father may be right, Vincent," Joe said calmly. "Philosophy is often born from necessity. But I'd argue that people who have money without understanding it are far more dangerous than people who think deeply about its meaning. The former create disasters, the latter try to prevent them." The bell rang. Students flooded toward the door. "Vincent, stay back for a moment, please." The teenager approached with exaggerated reluctance. "What? I have lunch. I've noticed you're struggling in this class." Joe kept his voice gentle. "Your midterm essay was 3 paragraphs when I asked for 3 pages. You've missed 4 assignments." "My dad donates $20,000 a year to this school," Vincent interrupted. "I think that buys me a little flexibility." Joe felt something crack inside him, not anger, but deep sadness for a young man who believed money could substitute for effort, for learning, for growth. "Your father's donations are generous," Joe said carefully, "but they don't purchase your education. That's something only you can earn." "Whatever." Vincent grabbed his backpack. "This class is boring anyway. When am I ever going to use the New Deal in real life?" "I hope you never have to," Joe said quietly as the teenager walked away. "I hope you never find yourself needing to understand how quickly stability can vanish." Vincent didn't respond. He had better things to do than listen to some middle-aged teacher drone about ancient history. Joe stood in the empty classroom, surrounded by posters of historical moments, and felt unfamiliar doubt. Had he reached any of them? Did any of this matter? He didn't know that in less than a decade, he would discover the answer in the cruelest way possible. The years that followed were kind to Joe, at least for a while. He married Helen, a fellow teacher who taught English with the same passionate dedication. Together they created a home filled with books, conversation, and the quiet joy of finding your person in a brutal world. They never had children, but in a sense they had thousands. Every student who passed through their classrooms, every young mind they touched. "Do you think we make a difference?" Helen asked one evening as they graded papers at their kitchen table. Joe looked at his wife, reading glasses perched on her nose, gray streaking through her hair, laugh lines from decades of joy. "I think we make a difference to some, and that has to be enough." "It is enough," Helen agreed, squeezing his hand. But the world outside was changing. The housing market bloated with speculation. Investment banks created instruments so complex even they didn't understand them. Beneath it all, a foundation built on sand began to crack. September 2008 arrived like thunder. Joe and Helen watched with growing horror as Lehman Brothers collapsed, as AIG teetered, as the market plunged hundreds of points in single days. Their retirement savings, carefully accumulated over 30 years, evaporated in weeks. "It'll recover," Helen said, though her voice shook. "The market always recovers." But their school, a small private academy they'd helped found for underserved students, didn't recover. Donors pulled back. Parents lost jobs. Within 6 months, the school closed forever. Joe and Helen found themselves in their mid-50s, unemployed, their savings gone, facing a mortgage on a house now worth half what they'd paid. "We'll find new positions," Joe said, trying to inject optimism despite the panic in his chest. Public schools are always hiring. But public schools were cutting positions, not hiring. Budget crises meant layoffs, eliminations. Joe sent out hundreds of applications. 3 interviews, no offers. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday in March 2010. Joe sat at their kitchen table, the paper in his hands, feeling something break that had never broken before. His belief that hard work and doing right would be enough. "We fought so hard," he whispered. "We did," Helen said, hands on his shoulders, voice thick with tears. "We did everything right, and the system failed us anyway." They lost the house in May, lost most possessions in June when they couldn't afford storage, moved into Helen's sister's basement in July, Two proud, educated people in their late 50s, dependent on family charity, feeling the particular shame of needing help they couldn't repay. Then, in August 2011, Helen collapsed during dinner. Massive stroke. Catastrophic. She lingered 3 days in ICU, machines breathing for her, while Joe sat beside her talking about all the students they'd taught, all the lives they'd touched. "You were right," he whispered, holding her hand. "We made a difference. We made enough of a difference." Helen died on a Thursday morning as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, and Joe felt the last solid thing in his foundation crumble away. The descent from respectable educator to homeless man took less time than Joe would have believed possible. Helen's sister was kind, but she had her own struggles, her own family. Joe couldn't be another burden indefinitely. He found a shelter, lost his spot when too many younger, more aggressive men crowded in, found a doorway, lost it when the business owner called police, found a spot under a bridge, lost it to flooding. By winter 2012, Joe had learned the invisible geography of homelessness. Which library bathrooms had warm water, which restaurants threw out good food, which police would leave you alone. He kept reading. That was the one thing he couldn't surrender. Books were free at the library, and knowledge was the last possession no one could take. He read philosophy, history, linguistics, astronomy, everything that could keep his mind sharp even as his body grew weathered. "What you reading, Professor?" asked Tom, another homeless man near the library. Tom was younger, maybe 40, undone by addiction rather than economic collapse. "Marcus Aurelius," Joe replied. "Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. Wrote about controlling what you can control and accepting what you cannot." "Sounds depressing," Tom said without judgment. "Sounds like survival," Joe corrected gently. "When you've lost everything external, you learn the only thing you truly own is how you respond." Tom nodded slowly. "You're a weird dude, Professor, but I like you." It became Joe's nickname, Professor. The old man who read philosophy and helped younger homeless folks fill out applications or write resumes. The guy who knew things, who remembered facts, who explained complex ideas in ways that made sense. Vincent Pratt, had he looked closely at his viral video, might have noticed something familiar about the old man's face, the way he held himself, the particular cadence of his speech. But Vincent never looked closely. He never had. The video spread like wildfire. By the time Joe woke the morning after his humiliation, millions had watched Vincent hand him money and mock him for questioning the gesture's sincerity. Most comments were predictably cruel. "Homeless guy should be grateful instead of acting entitled. This is why I don't give money to beggars. Old dude probably has more money than us. These scammers are experts." Vincent Pratt for president, someone who tells it like it is. But scattered among the mockery were other voices. Anyone else think the old man had a point? Something wrong about filming homeless people for content. The way he talks, clearly educated. Wonder what his story is. The old man's eyes, intelligence there, and sadness. Joe was unaware of the digital firestorm. He didn't own a phone, didn't have internet access except occasionally at the library. He spent the morning of his viral fame doing what he did every morning. Washing in McDonald's bathroom, accepting coffee from the manager who'd developed a soft spot for him, walking to the park where he sometimes told stories to children. "Mr. Joe," 7-year-old Emma ran up, her mother walking behind with a stroller. "Tell me about the Romans." "The Romans," Joe began, settling on a bench while Emma sat at his feet, "were masters of engineering. They built roads so well that some still exist 2,000 years later. They understood that if you wanted to build an empire, you first had to build the infrastructure that would support it." Emma's mother, Sarah, watched with mixed feelings. She appreciated someone engaging her daughter's curiosity, teaching her things. But she also felt uncomfortable tension, allowing her child to interact with a homeless man. Social conditioning that said such people were dangerous. Still, in 6 months of these morning encounters, Mr. Joe had never been anything but gentle, educational, appropriate. Her daughter had learned more history from this homeless man than from expensive private school. "You're good with kids," Sarah said, speaking directly to Joe for the first time. "Were you a teacher?" Joe looked up, surprised to be addressed by an adult. "I was. Long time ago." "What happened?" Sarah asked, then immediately felt terrible. I'm sorry, that was rude. No, it's all right, Joe interrupted gently. Life happened, economy crashed, lost my job, savings, home, wife. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. But I haven't lost my mind or knowledge, so I share what I can. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I'm so sorry. Don't be, Joe said. I've learned more about human nature in 3 years on the streets than in 30 years in a classroom. It's been an education in its own right. 3 miles across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Vincent Pratt was having the best morning of his life. His video had gone viral exactly as he'd hoped. Millions of views, tens of thousands of new followers, DMs filled with brands wanting to collaborate. Babe, look at this, he called to his girlfriend Melissa, who was doing yoga in the living room. Luxury Auto wants to sponsor a whole series. 6 figures. Melissa paused her downward dog. That's amazing. See, I told you the homeless thing would work. People eat that shit up. I know, right? Vincent scrolled through comments, basking in validation. And the best part is, I actually helped that guy. Gave him $100. Win-win. Did you see the negative comments? Melissa asked. Some people saying it was exploitative? Vincent snorted. Haters gonna hate. Those are just jealous people who complain about poverty from their phones instead of actually doing something. What Vincent didn't know, couldn't have known, was that among the millions watching was a 26-year-old investigative journalist named Maria Collins, and she'd recognized something in the old man's face that Vincent had missed. Dignity masking deep intelligence, education apparent in every carefully chosen word. Maria had made a career finding stories others overlooked, giving voice to people society preferred to ignore. Something about the old man in Vincent's video called to her professional instincts and personal conscience. She saved the video, took screenshots, and began what journalists do: research, investigate, uncover. It took her 3 days to find him. Joe was sitting outside the library on Saturday afternoon, reading about comparative linguistics, when a woman approached. Young, professionally dressed, carrying a notebook and wearing determination tempered with compassion. Excuse me, she said softly. Are you Joseph Anderson? Joe looked up, immediately wary. People who knew his name usually wanted something. Who's asking? My name is Maria Collins. I'm a journalist with the Chicago Tribune. She showed press credentials. I saw a video posted online, a video of a young man giving you money. Joe's face closed like a slamming door. I don't want to talk about that. I understand, Maria said, sitting on the bench, not too close, respecting his space. But I'm not interested in the video itself. I'm interested in your story. Because I did research, Mr. Anderson. I know you were a teacher. I found your employment records from Lincoln Park Academy. Joe's hands tightened on his book. That was another life. I know you lost everything in the financial crisis. Maria continued gently. I know your wife died. I know you've been homeless almost 3 years. And I know, she paused, that you're one of the most educated people currently living on Chicago's streets. Master's degree in history from Northwestern. 32 years teaching. Author of 3 published papers on pedagogical methods. Joe was silent. Finally, what do you want from me? I want to tell your story, Maria replied simply. The real story, not what that viral video tells. I want people to understand that homelessness isn't moral failing or choice. It's failure of systems, of safety nets, of a society that discards people when they're no longer economically productive. And what good would that do? Joe asked, voice tired. People see what they want to see. That video has millions of views. Why would anyone care about truth? Because, Maria said with quiet conviction, truth matters. Stories matter. Your story, an educated, dedicated man who did everything right and still lost everything, challenges the comfortable narrative that poverty only happens to people who deserve it. Joe studied her face, looking for exploitation, performative compassion, empty charity like Vincent had offered. But what he saw was genuine curiosity, professional determination, and something that looked like respect. All right, he said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. Nothing that makes me look like a victim, Joe said firmly. I've made choices, good and bad. I don't want pity, and nothing that exploits other homeless people for emotional content. If you tell my story, tell it with complexity and nuance, not as poverty porn. Maria smiled. Deal. She pulled out her notebook. Let's start with Lincoln Park Academy. Tell me about your teaching career. What followed was a 4-hour conversation ranging across Joe's entire life: childhood in a working-class family, determination to get educated, love of teaching, marriage to Helen, the crisis that destroyed everything, and years on streets that taught him more about America's class divide than any textbook. The thing about being homeless, Joe said as sunset, is you become invisible. People look through you. They create elaborate narratives about who you are and why, and those narratives are always designed to make them feel better about not helping. He's probably an addict. He chose this. He'd waste any money. It's easier than confronting the reality that the distance between stability and the street is much shorter than anyone wants to believe. Maria wrote furiously, hand cramping. And the young man in the video, Vincent Pratt. Did you recognize him? Joe paused. Should I have? He was your student, Maria said. 20 years ago, I found his records. He was in your 11th grade history class. Failed it twice. Joe's eyebrows rose. Vincent. He closed his eyes, searching memory. Vincent Pratt, yes. Smart kid actually, but lazy. Entitled. Believed his family's money would solve any problem. He opened his eyes with a sad smile. I guess he was right about that. How does it feel? Maria asked carefully. Knowing a former student treated you that way? Honestly, Joe thought, it feels like I failed him. Not in the classroom, though I did that too. But I failed to teach him the one lesson that really mattered, that wealth without wisdom is just another form of poverty. Maria's article published Tuesday morning. From Teacher to Streets, the Hidden Cost of Economic Collapse. 6,000 words tracing Joe's journey from respected educator to invisible homeless man, weaving in statistics about homelessness, structural critiques of inequality, and devastating indictment of performative charity culture. The article went viral differently than Vincent's video. This sparked genuine conversations, made people uncomfortable in productive ways, forced readers to confront assumptions about poverty and worth. By Wednesday afternoon, the Tribune's website had 2 million visitors. By Thursday, national outlets were picking it up. By Friday, Joe found himself surrounded by cameras asking, "How do you feel about Vincent Pratt now?" "I feel," Joe said carefully, Maria by his side, "that Mr. Pratt is young and still learning. We all make mistakes. The question isn't whether someone makes a mistake, but whether they learn from it." His grace only made the public angrier at Vincent. Social media turned on the young influencer with savage speed. Comment sections filled with outrage. Brands pulled sponsorships. Follower count dropped by hundreds of thousands. Vincent, watching his empire crumble, felt something rare, genuine fear. Not of poverty, his family's wealth ensured he'd never truly struggle, but fear of irrelevance, of becoming the villain in a story he'd thought he was writing as hero. "This is insane," he raged to Melissa, throwing his phone across the living room. "I was helping him. I gave him money." "Maybe you should apologize," Melissa suggested nervously. She'd been feeling social consequences too. Friends growing distant, invitations drying up. Apologize? For what? For being generous? But even as Vincent said it, he knew it rang hollow. He'd watched Joe's interview, seen the intelligence in those eyes, the dignity in his bearing, and felt for the first time an uncomfortable twinge that might have been shame. He tried to ignore it, posted a response video defending himself. More dislikes than likes within an hour. Posted again with more anger, accusing critics of virtue signaling. Made things worse. By week's end, Vincent Pratt had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything wrong with influencer culture, performative charity, the way wealth insulates people from understanding the humanity of those less fortunate. And then fate intervened in the form of fire. It was Tuesday afternoon when smoke began pouring from the 23rd floor of Pratt Tower, a luxury residential high-rise built by Vincent's father's construction company. The building was relatively new, completed 18 months earlier, gleaming monument to modern architecture and Pratt family engineering prowess. Joe was in the area when he heard screams. Years of teaching had trained him to respond to crisis rather than flee, and despite his age and condition, he found himself running toward chaos. Fire department still 3 minutes away when Joe reached the building. Smoke poured from upper windows. People streamed from the lobby, coughing, crying, some with minor burns. In confusion, he heard a voice cutting through noise. "My son! Oh God, my son is still up there!" A woman in her 40s, well-dressed, mascara running, trying to push past security back into the building. "He went back for his iPad. He's only 9. Someone has to—" Joe didn't think. Thinking would have stopped him. He simply moved, slipping past guards in chaos, heading for emergency stairs. Years of invisibility had taught him how to move through crowds unnoticed. Smoke grew thicker as he climbed, floor after floor, lungs burning, legs screaming. But he kept climbing because somewhere up there was a child, and no one else could reach him before fire spread. 23rd floor, heat intense, smoke so thick he could barely see. He dropped to hands and knees, remembering fire safety from decades ago. Hot air rises, stay low, breathe through fabric, and crawled down hallway calling, "Hello? Anyone here? Call out if you hear me." A small voice, terrified. "Help! I'm here! I can't find the door!" Joe followed the voice to a corner unit. Door hot but not engulfed. He wrapped his jacket around his hand and tried the knob, locked from inside. "Step back from the door!" Using strength he didn't know he still possessed, Joe kicked at the door near the lock. Once, twice, 3 times. 4th kick, the frame splintered. Inside, a boy, dark-haired, maybe 9, holding an iPad and crying, stood frozen in the living room. Balcony door opened behind him, flames visible on floor above. "Come here," Joe said, keeping his voice calm despite terror screaming in his mind. "Come to me right now." The boy ran. Joe grabbed him, wrapped him in his jacket, headed back toward emergency stairs. Behind them, something exploded. Gas line maybe, or electronics. Joe just kept moving, carrying a child who was probably 70 pounds, but felt like 200 in exhausted arms. Down the stairs, 1 floor, 2, 3. Firefighters appeared on 15th floor, ascending in full gear. "Give him to me," one shouted, and Joe gratefully transferred the boy to stronger, younger arms. "There's no one else," Joe gasped. "Floor 23, corner unit, only him." "You need oxygen," the firefighter said, but Joe was already sitting on stairs, unable to go further, body finally giving up now that adrenaline was fading. They carried him out. He barely remembered the descent, EMTs surrounding him, oxygen mask, questions he couldn't quite answer because his brain was fuzzy with smoke inhalation and exhaustion. When his head cleared, he was in an ambulance. Through open doors, he could see the boy reunited with his mother, both crying and holding each other. The woman looked over, caught Joe's eye, and mouthed 2 words that made everything hurt. "Thank you." The boy's name was Marcus Pratt, Vincent Pratt's nephew, son of Vincent's older brother Daniel, an executive at Pratt Construction. This information emerged gradually as Joe sat in the emergency room, being treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. "Mr. Anderson," a detective said, approaching his bed with notepad. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen. I need to ask questions about the fire." "I don't know how it started," Joe said, voice hoarse. "I just heard screaming and went in." "That's not what I'm asking about," Detective Chen said. "When firefighters reached the 23rd floor, they found signs of structural failure. Improperly installed fire suppression systems, substandard insulation materials, wiring that didn't meet code. These don't typically cause fires, but they make fires much more dangerous." She paused. "You're listed in our database as having a master's in history and 32 years teaching. But during your statement to EMTs, you mentioned specific technical failures in the building's construction. How did you know?" Joe blinked, trying to remember what he'd said. "I don't know. I just noticed things. Fire spread too fast. Suppression system didn't activate. Emergency lighting was inadequate." "Mr. Anderson," Detective Chen said carefully, "those are very specific technical observations. Most people, even firefighters, wouldn't notice them in the moment." "I read a lot," Joe said. "Building codes, safety regulations. The library has books on everything." Detective Chen studied him. "I'm going to need a detailed statement. Everything you remember about the building's condition, fire spread, any structural issues you observed." Over the next 2 hours, Joe gave a statement later described by investigators as remarkably detailed and technically sophisticated. He described exit signs not where code required, Fire doors propped open, sprinkler heads painted over, and a dozen other violations his years of reading and teacher's eye for detail had allowed him to notice even in moments of crisis. "Mr. Anderson," Detective Chen said when he finished, "did you ever work in construction or building inspection?" "No," Joe said. "Just teaching, but I taught history, which includes history of building codes, urban planning, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that led to modern safety regulations." He trailed off, realizing how strange it must sound. "I guess I retained more than I thought." Detective Chen closed her notebook. "Well, your observations will be very valuable to our investigation. We were already looking at Pratt Construction for potential violations on other projects. This might be the evidence we need." "Pratt Construction?" Joe said slowly. "As in Vincent Pratt's family. Daniel Pratt's company, technically, though Vincent is listed as consultant." Detective Chen studied his face. "You know Vincent Pratt?" Joe almost laughed at the absurdity. "You could say we've had a recent interaction." The news cycle moved fast. By evening, every major outlet covered the story. Homeless hero saves child from burning building. Joe's face was everywhere, his gray beard and calm blue eyes instantly recognizable. But this time, the narrative was different. Maria Collins broke the secondary story next morning. Hero who saved Pratt Air was his uncle's former teacher and recent viral humiliation victim. The connection exploded across social media with revelation force. People began pulling up Vincent's video, watching with new eyes, seeing the old man Vincent mocked as the same person who'd risked his life to save Vincent's nephew. "The man you humiliated saved your family." One tweet with 500,000 likes read, "What does that say about who deserves respect?" Vincent saw it all unfolding from his penthouse. He watched news footage of Joe being carried out, oxygen mask over face. He watched his brother Daniel giving tearful interview about the man who saved Marcus, and he felt something crack open inside. Not shame yet, but the beginning of it, the first hairline fracture in a fortress of arrogance built over decades. "You need to make a statement," his publicist James said over the phone. "Express gratitude, show humility." "I know," Vincent said, but words stuck in his throat. Gratitude felt like surrender, like admitting he'd been wrong, and Vincent Pratt had built his entire identity on being right, on being better, on being above. Meanwhile, Detective Chen's investigation widened. The fire at Pratt Tower had been caused by electrical failure, but speed and intensity of spread were due to systematic code violations. Fire-rated materials swapped for cheaper alternatives, safety systems installed incorrectly or not at all, inspections falsified, and Joe's detailed statement, combined with testimony from construction workers who'd been afraid to speak before, painted a picture of a company that prioritized profit margins over human safety. Daniel Pratt sat in a conference room at Pratt Construction headquarters, face ashen as company lawyers explained the scope of potential liability. "Criminal negligence," one lawyer said. "Possibly manslaughter if anyone had died. The city is pulling permits on all current projects. Insurance carriers dropping coverage. And the civil suits." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "How did this happen?" Daniel asked, though he knew the answer. He'd approved the cost-cutting measures, signed off on cheaper contractors, pushed project managers to finish faster, cheaper, better, and when faster and cheaper conflicted with better, he'd chosen profits. "The old man who saved your son," another lawyer said. His statement to the fire marshal is being treated as expert testimony. He documented violations our own safety inspectors missed or chose to ignore. Daniel's hands trembled. "I want to meet him. Joseph Anderson. I need to meet him." They arranged the meeting at the hospital where Joe was kept for observation. Daniel Pratt arrived with his wife and son, all three looking like they'd barely slept. Marcus, the 9-year-old, carried a drawing he'd made, a picture of a man in a cape labeled Hero Joe. Joe sat up in his hospital bed when they entered. He'd been reading, of course, a book on Roman engineering someone had brought from the library. He marked his page and set it aside. "Mr. Anderson," Daniel began, and his voice broke immediately. I can't, there aren't words." Marcus didn't wait for his father to finish. He ran to Joe's bedside and thrust out the drawing. "You saved me. Thank you for saving me." Joe took the drawing with gentle hands. studying it with the same careful attention he'd given to centuries of student artwork. "You're very welcome, Marcus. This is a wonderful drawing. You made my cape very heroic." "Are you really homeless?" Marcus asked with the direct honesty of children. "Marcus," his mother started, but Joe raised a hand. "It's all right." "Yes, Marcus, I am. I don't have a house or apartment. I sleep in shelters or outside." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because sometimes life gives us challenges that are very hard to overcome," Joe said. "I lost my job and home during hard economic times, and I haven't been able to find my way back yet." "That's not fair," Marcus said with the moral clarity of youth. "No," Joe agreed. "It's not fair, but fairness and reality don't always align." Daniel finally found his voice. "Mr. Anderson, I need you to know what you did for my son, for my family. I can never repay it, but I also need you to know that I'm horrified by what my brother did to you. I saw the video. I was disgusted. And now, learning that you were his teacher," he shook his head. "Vincent should have learned better. I should have taught him better. You're not responsible for your brother's choices," Joe said gently. "No, but I'm responsible for creating a culture that valued wealth over wisdom," Daniel replied. "My company, the building you went into, the fire spread so fast because we cut corners, because I approved decisions that prioritized profit margins over safety, because I lost sight of what actually matters." Tears were running down his face now. "You nearly died saving my son from consequences of my greed." Joe was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Pratt, may I tell you something I learned in 32 years of teaching?" "Please." "People are not fixed points. We're all capable of learning, of growing, of changing. The question isn't whether you made mistakes. The question is what you do with the knowledge of those mistakes." Daniel nodded, wiping his eyes. "The company is shutting down. All projects halted. I'm cooperating fully with investigations. Whatever happens, I deserve it." "And after?" Joe asked. "After the investigations, after the consequences, after the dust settles, what will you do with what you've learned?" It was a teacher's question, and Daniel recognized it as such. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't go back to who I was." "Then you've already started learning," Joe said. "That's the hardest part, recognizing that change is necessary." Monica, Daniel's wife, spoke for the first time. "How do you, after everything that's happened to you, after losing everything, after being treated so poorly, how do you still have grace, kindness? How are you not bitter?" Joe considered the question carefully. "I didn't say I wasn't bitter. Bitterness comes and goes. But I learned something on the streets that I never fully understood in the classroom. Dignity isn't about your circumstances. It's about your choices. I can't control what happened to me. I can't control how others treat me. But I can control how I respond." He smiled slightly. "It's a lesson from Marcus Aurelius, actually. The Stoics believed that the only thing we truly own is our character. Everything else is borrowed, temporary, subject to the whims of fate." "Is that what you were reading?" Marcus asked, pointing to the book. "About Marcus?" "Different Marcus," Joe said. "But yes, similar wisdom." He looked at the boy seriously. "Would you like to learn about the Romans? They built things that lasted thousands of years." "Yes," Marcus said enthusiastically. And so Joe taught, there in that hospital room, explaining Roman engineering principles to a 9-year-old boy, while the boy's parents watched and realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a homeless man sharing knowledge, but a master teacher who had never stopped teaching, even when the world stopped paying him to do it. Vincent Pratt watched the news coverage of his brother's meeting with Joe Anderson and felt the walls closing in. Everyone was changing, learning, growing, everyone except him. His brother was facing consequences with dignity. His nephew was calling a homeless man a hero. And Vincent was the villain in a story writing itself without his input. His phone rang. His father, Richard Pratt. "Vincent, we need to talk." They met at his father's study in the family estate, a room Vincent had always associated with power and success. But today it felt different, smaller somehow, the walls lined with photos of buildings and awards that suddenly seemed hollow. "I built this company from nothing," Richard began without preamble. 40 years of work, and in less than 2 years, your brother has destroyed it, cut corners, falsified inspections, prioritized profits over safety. He looked at Vincent with eyes that held profound disappointment. But you know what the worst part is? Vincent shook his head, afraid to speak. I created the culture that made it possible. I taught you boys that money was the measure of success, that wealth meant you were better than others, that poor people were poor because of moral failings. Richard's voice cracked. I was wrong. And now Daniel is facing criminal charges. Our company is bankrupt, and you've become internet famous for humiliating a man who saved your nephew's life. Dad, that man was your teacher, Vincent. Richard pulled out a folder, opening it to reveal Vincent's old report cards. Joseph Anderson taught you 11th grade history. You failed his class twice. Do you know what he wrote in his evaluation? He read aloud. Vincent is intelligent but refuses to apply himself. He believes his family's wealth exempts him from effort. Unless he learns that success requires character as well as capital, he will struggle to find meaning in life. Vincent stared at the words written in Joe's careful handwriting 20 years ago. They were prophecy and indictment. He was right, Richard said, and I'm the one who taught you that he was wrong. I'm the one who told you that money could solve any problem, that wealth made you better than others, that people like Joseph Anderson didn't matter because they didn't have power or influence. He closed the folder. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Vincent had never heard his father apologize for anything. The sound of it broke something inside him, or maybe finally allowed something broken to begin healing. What do I do? Vincent asked, his voice small. You start by understanding that you can't buy your way out of this, Richard said. You can't make a viral apology video and expect forgiveness. You have to actually change. And change is hard, Vincent. It requires humility, effort, and willingness to admit you were fundamentally wrong about how the world works. I don't know how to do that. Then learn, Richard said. That's what teachers are for. And you have access to one of the best teachers Chicago has ever produced. If he's willing to teach you again. Joe was released from the hospital 3 days after the fire. He expected to return to the streets, to his familiar geography of survival, but instead found himself at the center of an unexpected movement. Maria Collins had written a follow-up piece, What We Owe Joseph Anderson. It outlined not just his heroism, but the systemic failures that had made his homelessness possible, and the community of teachers, students, and citizens who wanted to do something about it. A GoFundMe campaign raised $200,000 in 48 hours. Offers of housing flooded in. The teachers' union, embarrassed by how one of their own had fallen through the cracks, offered him a position as a consultant on educational policy. Joe accepted the housing, a modest one-bedroom apartment in a building that served formerly homeless veterans and elderly citizens. He accepted the consulting position, but he refused most of the money, instead asking that it be used to create a scholarship fund in Helen's name for students from low-income families who wanted to become teachers. I don't need wealth, he told Maria in an interview. I need purpose, and I already have that. The Helen Anderson Memorial Teaching Scholarship was established in September. Its first recipient was a 22-year-old woman from the South Side who had been working 3 jobs while trying to finish her education degree. Joe attended the award ceremony in clothes that Maria had helped him buy. Simple, practical, dignified. He looked like what he'd always been, a teacher. Helen would have loved this, he said in his brief speech. She believed that teaching was the most important work anyone could do. Not the most profitable, not the most celebrated, but the most important, because teachers don't just share knowledge, they shape futures. In the audience, uncomfortable in a seat near the back, sat Vincent Pratt. He'd been trying to work up the courage to approach Joe for weeks. He'd drafted and deleted dozens of messages. He'd started and stopped multiple apology videos. Nothing felt adequate. Nothing felt sincere enough. After the ceremony, as people mingled with coffee and cookies in the university hall, Vincent finally forced himself to move. He walked up to Joe, who was talking with a group of current teachers, and waited at the edge of the conversation like a student waiting for office hours. Joe noticed him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Joe excused himself from the other teachers and turned to face his former student. Mr. Pratt, he said evenly. Mr. Anderson, Vincent replied, his voice shaking. I need to apologize. You don't need to do anything, Joe said. But if you want to apologize, I'm willing to listen." They moved to a quieter corner. Vincent struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of his shame. "I was cruel," he finally said. "I humiliated you for entertainment. I treated you like you were less than human because you were homeless. And then I found out you were my teacher, and that you saved my nephew, and I realized—" He stopped, tears streaming down his face. "I realized that you were trying to teach me even then, on that street corner. You were trying to teach me about dignity and respect and the difference between charity and compassion, and I was too arrogant to learn." Joe listened without interruption, his teacher's instinct telling him when to let a student struggle toward understanding on their own. "I don't expect forgiveness," Vincent continued. "I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand that I was wrong. About everything." "What changed?" Joe asked. "Not my circumstances. I was just as worthy of respect on that street corner as I am now." "So what changed in you?" Vincent thought about it. "Consequence. I saw real consequence. My brother's company collapsing. My nephew nearly dying. You nearly dying. The cruelty I participated in suddenly became real instead of abstract." "That's a start," Joe said. "But consequence-based morality is fragile. What happens when you can avoid consequences? When wealth or power insulates you again?" It was a teaching moment, and Vincent recognized it as such. "Then I need something more fundamental." "You need empathy," Joe said. "Not sympathy, not pity, but genuine empathy. The ability to recognize the full humanity of people whose circumstances differ from yours. The understanding that there but for fortune go you." "How do I learn that?" Vincent asked. Joe considered. "The same way you learn anything. Through experience, practice, and humility. Are you willing to do the work?" "Yes," Vincent said immediately, then paused. "But I don't know what the work is." "Then let me teach you," Joe said. Again. "But this time, you actually have to do the reading." What followed was an unlikely arrangement. 3 times a week, Vincent met Joe at his new apartment. They didn't discuss influencer culture or wealth or viral videos. Instead, Joe assigned reading. "We're going to start with history," Joe said in their first real session. "Because you can't understand the present without understanding the past, and you can't build a better future without learning from both." Vincent read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. He read Matthew Desmond's Evicted. He read Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed. Books about poverty, inequality, structural injustice, and the lived experiences of people he'd never bothered to understand. After each reading, they discussed. And Joe taught the way he'd always taught, not by lecturing, but by asking questions that forced Vincent to think critically, to examine his assumptions, to recognize his blind spots. "Why do you think we, as a society, prefer to believe that poverty is a personal failure rather than a systemic one?" Joe asked during a discussion of Evicted. Vincent thought about it. "Because if it's systemic, we're complicit. If it's personal, we can feel okay about not helping." "Yes," Joe said. And if I admit that homelessness can happen to good people who did everything right, then I have to admit it could happen to me." "There you go," Joe said with the satisfaction of a teacher watching a student grasp a difficult concept. "Fear drives much of our cruelty. We're terrified of vulnerability, so we create distance through judgment." The lessons continued. Joe assigned Vincent practical exercises too. "I want you to volunteer at a homeless shelter. Not for a photo opportunity, not for your social media. Anonymously, regularly." Vincent did. He served meals at the Pacific Garden Mission 3 nights a week. He listened to stories. He learned names. He began to see the faces behind the statistics, the full human beings behind the labels. One night he met Tom, the man who had befriended Joe on the streets. Tom was 62, a veteran, struggling with PTSD and alcoholism, but trying to stay sober. "You're that internet guy," Tom said when they were introduced. "The one who was mean to the professor." Vincent flinched. "Yes, I'm trying to be better." "Good," Tom said. "Professor's a good man. Helped me a lot. Helped a lot of us." "How?" Vincent asked. "Treated us like humans," Tom said simply. "Listened to our stories. Didn't judge. Knew things. Helped us fill out forms, write resumes, understand legal stuff, but mostly just saw us. You know? Vincent nodded, finally understanding what Joe had been trying to teach him on that street corner. Dignity wasn't something you gave people with money. It was something you recognized in every human being simply because they existed. Meanwhile, the investigation into Pratt Construction concluded. Daniel Pratt was charged with multiple counts of criminal negligence and fraud. The company filed for bankruptcy. Properties were sold to pay settlements to injured workers and residents. The Pratt family's fortune, built over 40 years, dissolved in months. Vincent watched his brother face sentencing. 3 years in federal prison, millions in fines, permanent professional disgrace. He watched his father, humbled and heartbroken, work with investigators to expose every corner-cutting decision, every falsified inspection, every moment when profit was prioritized over safety. And he realized that this was what Joe had meant by consequence. Not punishment, but the natural result of actions. The price of arrogance, of disconnection from the humanity of others, of believing that wealth insulated you from moral responsibility. His own reckoning came in quieter ways. Lost friendships, dropped sponsorships, the slow rebuilding of a reputation from rubble. But Joe kept teaching, kept assigning reading, kept asking questions that forced Vincent to think beyond himself. "I want you to write something," Joe said 6 months into their arrangement. "An essay, not for publication, just for yourself. Title, What I've Learned." Vincent spent 3 weeks on it. He wrote about shame, about privilege, about the distance between charity and solidarity. He wrote about Tom and Marcus and Maria and all the people whose full humanity he'd failed to recognize. And he wrote about Joe, the teacher he'd failed twice in high school and was now failing differently, by trying too hard to earn forgiveness instead of simply learning the lessons. When he gave the essay to Joe, his hands shook. Joe read it in silence, his teacher's pen making occasional marks in the margins. When he finished, he looked up at Vincent with an expression that was hard to read. "This is good," he said. "Honest, self-aware. You're learning." But Vincent heard the unspoken qualification. "But learning isn't enough," Joe said. "Understanding without action is just intellectual exercise. The question isn't whether you understand what you did wrong. The question is what you're going to do with that understanding." "What should I do?" "That's not for me to tell you," Joe said. "That's the final lesson, Vincent. I can't give you a rubric for redemption. You have to figure out what it means to actually live differently, to use whatever privilege and platform you have left to make things better rather than to elevate yourself." Vincent sat with that challenge for days, then weeks, and finally, an answer emerged. 14 months after the viral video, a new building opened on Chicago's South Side. It wasn't flashy or architecturally dramatic, but it was solid, carefully built, meeting every safety code and then some. The Helen Anderson Community Learning Center was a free educational space offering GED classes, job training, English language instruction, and college prep for adults who'd missed opportunities earlier in life. It was funded by a foundation created with what remained of the Pratt family fortune after settlements and fines, about $12 million that Richard and Vincent Pratt had decided to dedicate to education rather than rebuilding their company. Joe stood at the opening ceremony, looking at the building that bore his late wife's name, and felt something he hadn't felt since before the crash of 2008. Hope. "She would have loved this," he said to Maria, who stood beside him, notepad ready as always. "She would have loved that you inspired it," Maria corrected. "No," Joe said. "This exists because of a lot of people making better choices. I was just the catalyst." The ceremony was simple. No politicians grandstanding, no wealthy donors seeking recognition. Just a community gathering to celebrate a resource they needed and now had. Vincent was there, but not on stage. He'd learned that lesson at least, that some contributions are more valuable when made quietly. He'd been working at the center for 3 months already, teaching social media literacy and digital skills to older adults who'd been left behind by technological change. It was humbling work, poorly paid, often frustrating, but it was real in a way that his influencer career never had been. "Mr. Anderson," a voice said behind Joe. He turned to see Tom, cleaned up and sober 6 months now, holding a certificate. "Got my GED. Couldn't have done it without you." "I didn't do it," Joe said. "You did the work." "Yeah, but you made me believe I could," Tom replied. "That's what teachers do, right? Make people believe in themselves? Joe smiled. That's one of the things we do. The center opened its doors. Students flooded in, elderly immigrants working towards citizenship, young mothers trying to finish interrupted educations, formerly incarcerated people seeking job skills, homeless individuals trying to build stable lives. Joe walked through the bright, clean classrooms and felt Helen's presence in every corner. This was her legacy, but also the legacy of every teacher who'd ever believed that education was the great equalizer, that knowledge was power, that given the opportunity and support, anyone could learn and grow and transform their lives. In one classroom, he found Vincent teaching a group of seniors how to recognize online scams and fake news. The young man who'd once created performative charity content was now patiently explaining to 70-year-old Mrs. Chen how to verify sources and protect her banking information. "You're doing good work," Joe said quietly from the doorway. Vincent looked up, surprised. "I'm trying. Some days I wonder if I'm really making a difference." "That's how you know you're teaching," Joe said. "Teachers always wonder if they're making a difference. It's the ones who are certain they're making a difference that you have to worry about." Vincent laughed. "Is that another lesson?" "Everything is a lesson if you're paying attention." 2 years after the viral video that changed everything, Maria Collins published her final piece on the Joseph Anderson story. It was titled "The Long Game: How Patience, Dignity, and Teaching Can Transform a Culture." The article traced the ripples outward from that October night when Vincent Pratt handed a $100 bill to a homeless man. It documented the fire, the investigation, the trial, the sentencing of Daniel Pratt. But it also documented the quieter transformations. Vincent's journey from influencer to educator. Richard Pratt's work with advocacy groups on construction safety reform. The Helen Anderson Center's impact on thousands of students. And it documented Joe himself, not as a hero or a victim, but as what he'd always been, a teacher who never stopped teaching, even when the world stopped paying him to do it. "The most radical thing Joseph Anderson did," Maria wrote, "wasn't saving a child from a burning building. It was maintaining his dignity, his humanity, and his commitment to education when he had every reason to become bitter and cruel. And the second most radical thing he did was offer grace to the young man who humiliated him, choosing to teach rather than seek revenge." The article went viral in the way that genuinely good journalism sometimes does, not with outrage or mockery, but with reflection and thought. Vincent read it on his phone during a break from teaching and felt tears on his face. Not tears of shame this time, but something else. Something like gratitude. Something like understanding. He'd been given a gift, he realized. Not forgiveness. Joe had never actually said the words, "I forgive you." But something better, an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become someone different than he'd been. That evening, he stopped by Joe's apartment, as he did most evenings now. Joe was reading, as always, this time a book on Socratic dialogue. "Appropriate," Vincent said, pointing at the book, "the teacher who taught through questions." "You've been paying attention," Joe said with a smile. "I had a good teacher," Vincent replied. Then, after a pause, "Actually, I had a good teacher 20 years ago, too. I was just too arrogant to learn." "The student who is ready learns from every teacher," Joe said. "But the teacher who is patient waits for the student to be ready." "How did you know I'd be ready?" Joe set down his book. "I didn't. But I knew that everyone is capable of learning if they're willing to be uncomfortable, to question themselves, to do the work. You were willing." That was enough. Vincent nodded, taking in the simple apartment, the shelves of books, the modest life of a man who'd lost everything and rebuilt something more valuable than wealth. Purpose, community, dignity. "I've been thinking," Vincent said. "The center needs more funding, not just for operations, but for expansion. There are so many people who need what we offer." "Agreed," Joe said. "Do you have ideas?" "I still have some influence online," Vincent admitted. "Not what it was, but I have a platform. What if I used it differently? Not for attention or validation, but to actually educate people about inequality, about the structural causes of poverty, about the importance of supporting educational access." Joe considered. It would have to be done carefully, authentically. No performative redemption. "I know," Vincent said. "I've learned that much at least." "Then try," Joe said simply. "Try, fail, learn, adjust, Try again. That's how education works. That's how change works. 5 years after the viral video, the Helen Anderson Community Learning Center had expanded to 3 locations across Chicago. It had served over 10,000 students. It had helped 600 people earn their GED, facilitated 400 people getting job training and placement, and taught English to over 1,000 immigrants. Joe, now 73, served as educational director. He'd officially retired twice, but kept coming back because, as he told anyone who asked, teachers don't really retire, we just change classrooms. Vincent, at 35, had become the center's director of community outreach. He'd written a book about his experience, The $100 Lesson: What a Homeless Teacher Taught Me About Wealth, Dignity, and What Really Matters. All proceeds went to the center. The book was honest about his cruelty, his arrogance, his slow and painful transformation. It didn't position him as a hero or seek sympathy. It simply told the truth. That privilege is blinding. That humility is learned. That change is possible, but requires work. It sold moderately well. More importantly, it started conversations. Richard Pratt, now 70, volunteered at the center 3 days a week, teaching a class on business ethics that was really a class on the consequences of prioritizing profit over people. He was a man transformed by loss, humbled by the realization that everything he'd built had rested on an unstable foundation. Daniel Pratt served his 3 years, was released, and immediately came to work at the center. He taught construction skills the right way, with an emphasis on safety, quality, and integrity. He'd never get rich again. He didn't want to. He wanted to rebuild differently. Maria Collins had won a Pulitzer for her series on economic inequality and the personal stories behind structural injustice. She still wrote about Joe occasionally, but he'd made her promise to focus on the larger issues rather than making him a central figure. The story isn't me, he'd told her. The story is all the people who fell through the cracks, all the systems that failed, all the ways we can do better. I'm just one example. But Maria knew better. Joe was more than an example. He was a reminder that dignity isn't circumstantial, that knowledge is power, that teachers shape futures in ways that can't be measured in dollars. On a cool October evening, exactly 5 years after the viral video, Joe sat on a bench outside the Helen Anderson Center, watching students arrive for evening classes. Elderly men and women seeking their GED, young parents trying to learn English, formerly homeless individuals building new lives. Vincent sat beside him, both of them quiet, watching the flow of humanity seeking knowledge, opportunity, transformation. Do you think about that night? Vincent asked finally. The night I gave you that $100? Sometimes, Joe admitted. Do you wish it hadn't happened? Joe thought about it. If it hadn't happened, the fire investigation might not have been as thorough. Daniel might not have faced consequences. The center might not exist. Tom might not be sober. And you might still be making viral videos about helping people without actually helping them. He paused. So no, I don't wish it hadn't happened. I wish it had happened differently. But I can't change the past. None of us can. What about the future? The future, Joe said with a slight smile, is still being written. And unlike the past, we have some influence over how that story unfolds. They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, and the windows of the center glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, hundreds of people were learning, growing, transforming their lives through education. Outside, 2 men who'd been teacher and student twice, once when one was young and one was established, once when their positions reversed, contemplated the strange paths that had brought them here. Thank you, Vincent said quietly, for the second chance, for the teaching, for not giving up on me. I never gave up on you, Joe corrected. I just waited for you to be ready to learn. That's what teachers do. We plant seeds and trust that eventually, given the right conditions, they'll grow. Did you know I'd change? I hoped you would, Joe said. But I would have taught you either way. Because that's what teachers do. We teach. Not because we're certain of the outcome, but because we believe in the possibility of transformation. We believe that everyone can learn. That belief, that faith in human capacity for growth, that's what makes us teachers. Vincent nodded, taking in the wisdom of a man who'd lost everything and found something more valuable in the losing. a deeper understanding of what actually mattered. "I have one more question," Vincent said. "The $100 bill I gave you that night. What did you do with it?" Joe smiled. "I donated it to the library's book fund. Seemed appropriate. That money you gave me to mock my poverty bought books that helped educate people. Every act, even cruel ones, can be transformed into something useful if you know how to redirect the energy." Vincent laughed. Real laughter, not the performative laugh from his influencer days, but genuine mirth at the beautiful irony of it. "One more lesson," he said. "Always one more lesson," Joe agreed. "That's the thing about teaching and learning. It never really ends. We just keep going, keep growing, keep trying to be better than we were yesterday." They sat together as night fully settled over Chicago, teacher and student, both still learning, both still teaching, both forever changed by a cruel encounter that had become, through patience and grace and the transformative power of education, something redemptive. The center's lights stayed on late into the night, as they did every night, beacons in the darkness, promising that knowledge was available, that dignity was inherent, that transformation was possible. And in the morning, Joe would return to teach again, because that's what teachers do. They teach. Not for money or recognition or fame, but because they believe in the power of education to change lives, to build communities, to create the possibility of a more just and compassionate world. The story that began with cruelty ended with grace. The video that went viral for mockery became, in time, a catalyst for genuine change. And the $100 bill that symbolized performative charity transformed into something far more valuable. A lesson about dignity, humanity, and the long, difficult, beautiful work of becoming better than we were. Years later, when people asked Joe what he'd learned from his time on the streets, from the viral humiliation, from the fire and everything that followed, he would smile that patient teacher's smile and say simply, "I learned that we teach best not when life is easy, but when it's hard. I learned that dignity is a choice we make every day, regardless of circumstance. And I learned that the most important lessons are often taught not in classrooms, but on street corners, in hospital rooms, in moments of crisis when we're forced to decide who we really are." And then he would add with a twinkle in his eye, "But I already knew all that." Sometimes the teacher needs to be taught his own lessons again, just to remember why they matter.